Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I never used to believe much in urban legends. I had always assumed that they were mostly just used to discourage kids and teens from doing things that would get them into trouble or bother people in my hometown. So it never crossed my mind that maybe some of these stories had some level of truth to them. I mean, who's to say that your uncle's best friend's son's girlfriend didn't really notice claw marks on her car door the morning after a date at the park? After all, the mind sometimes makes up stories about things it can't explain. One unusual urban legend that's developed in my hometown over the years is so strange, but so consistent, that I have a hard time coming up with a rational explanation for it. Time and time again, I've heard variations of the same story, and the only real difference when I hear it is where it happens. The first time I heard the story, it involved a kid from one of our local high schools staying out too late, stopping by a local record store before closing, and hearing a strange song. He thought it might have just been a song picked by one of the employees with a taste for avant-garde music, but before he had a chance to ask what was playing, he found himself in a white room with no doors or windows and a large dent in one of the walls. For a moment, he couldn't move or speak, and he was faced with a robed figure who seemed to be in control of the room. As the robed figure approached the kid, he was afraid that the worst would happen, but he woke up on the floor of the record store, panting and sweating. Other variations involved people from completely different backgrounds and lifestyles, and different locations like restaurants, parks, and stores. What they all had in common was that before finding themselves in the white room, they heard a song they could never adequately describe, with lyrics they could never recall, and it always happened after dark. I could never come up with a rational explanation of what was happening, but I never took the story very seriously anyway. Maybe it was spun up by someone who just wanted to keep people from getting into trouble at night. Or maybe it was a story someone's older sibling made up to torment them. Other than that, I couldn't come up with any other explanation as to why the story probably wasn't true. The problem is that, even though now I've experienced it firsthand, I still can't explain how it happens. Earlier this year, I met up with my friends at the mall to get something to eat and walk around for a while. It was a typical Friday night. I bought some pretzel bites at the food court before my friends and I stopped at a few of the stores we visit every time we go to the mall, like a gag gift store and an anime store that always seems to have a different name and storefront every time we visit the mall. My closest friend, Tony, said he had some plans to go cycling the next morning, so he needed to head home, and the rest of our group quickly dwindled and left too. I remembered that I still needed to get a gift for my little sister's birthday that was coming up that same week, so I decided to take a few more minutes to myself to find a gift for her. As I walked through the mall, I noticed some of the employees began to pull down the gates they lock up whenever the stores close. It seemed like a not-so-subtle hint that it was time for me to check out or go home. I saw a jewelry store that sells a lot of cheap jewelry for younger girls and decided to go inside to look for a necklace or some earrings my sister might like. Knowing I had only a few minutes left, I tried to pick something quickly, and I settled on a necklace with a clover charm. When I checked out, I noticed the cashier seemed like she was in a hurry to get me out of there as quickly as possible. It came off a little rude, but I knew I was there right at closing time, so I didn't let it bother me. She handed me my bag and my receipt, and as I walked out the door, there was already another employee at the door ready to lock it as soon as I walked out. After I left and they locked the store, I headed toward the nearest elevator so I could head down to the parking lot on the first floor. I watched employees that must have closed their stores quickly shuffle out and head toward the exits. As I was leaving, I noticed how much louder the music over the speakers sounded without the sound of customers walking around and talking. I waited for the elevator to get back up to the second floor, and I stepped inside alone once the doors opened. I thought it was a little strange because I couldn't see any speakers, but I could hear the music coming from inside the elevator too. Now that I was alone in the elevator without many other sounds to distract me, I began to pay attention to the music, and I realized it was like nothing I had ever heard before. It had a steady rhythm like most pop music has, and it sounded strangely mechanical, but natural at the same time, like a small choir of machines. The vocalist had an accent that I had never heard, with an emphasis on the vowel sounds of the lyrics that sounded unnatural. His accent was so strong that I had a hard time understanding what he was singing, but one line stood out to me. "Don't be afraid of the dark. You'll find yourself in the light soon." The line repeated in my head even when the chorus ended. I didn't know why such an odd song was playing in the middle of a shopping mall, unless maybe the cleaning crew was able to put on their own music when all the stores shut down. It really gave me the creeps and only encouraged me to leave more quickly. But once I had started to really try listening to the song's lyrics, I realized that the elevator hadn't started moving. I pressed the first floor button and it lit up, but then became unlit without the elevator doing anything. I tried pressing it again and the same thing happened. Finally, I decided to try pressing the open door button, and the elevator started moving down. Being in the elevator was the last thing I wanted in that moment, but at least I was heading down to the first floor. The elevator couldn't have been descending very fast, but I suddenly became aware of a feeling in my stomach that felt like I was dropping on a roller coaster. I looked out of the elevator's glass walls and watched as the shops on the first floor came nearer, but as soon as I looked away or shifted my focus, they went right back down to where they had started. I tried to correct my vision and refocus on anything that might make it stop, but I kept seeing the same pattern of the elevator descending and shifting higher again. The pattern made me so dizzy that I had to close my eyes, and as soon as I closed them, I felt myself suddenly drop, as though the elevator crashed through the floor below. My body ached, and I thought I must have broken some bones because of the force of the drop, but when I tried to push myself up off the ground, I was able to get up with only some discomfort. There was no sign of the elevator around me. No broken glass, no metal scraps, no shattered light bulbs or electronics. All I could see around me were white walls. The silence that followed the crash was so deafening that it made my ears ring. What was happening to me seemed to be a quick series of events, but living it felt slow and excruciating. I could barely grasp my own thoughts before I noticed a gray blur in my vision where I had been looking ahead at one of the white walls. Like smoke drifting into the room, a man in a gray robe appeared in front of me. I could hardly tell whether he was old or young based on his facial features. The shape of his face was very angular and defined, but his large eyes and smooth face with tight skin made him look childlike. His hair seemed somewhere between silver and gray, but full and slicked back. He stared straight ahead at me with an expression somewhere between worried and serious, and without a word he lifted his arm and pointed toward the wall behind me. His sleeves hung low, and I could barely see the ends of his hands through the thick, droopy material. As I turned toward where he was pointing, I noticed the white wall behind me had a large dent in it, just like I remembered hearing about in stories since I was a kid. The robed man continued staring at me and began to approach with his arm outstretched toward me. As he approached me, I began to feel a pressure pushing me backward, the way it feels when you hold one magnet resisting another. The pressure pushed me up and back against the wall, and as my body set into it, I realized that it aligned perfectly with the dent that had been in the wall since I arrived in the white room. My arms were pressed up and raised against the wall like I was a scarecrow, and the pressure on my neck kept me from turning to either side. Having no choice but to look straight ahead, I watched the man. His gray robe shined softly in the light of the plain white room despite there being no clear light source to reflect. I could make out a faint reflection of myself in the seemingly metallic robe as he lifted his left hand to the side, outstretched to mirror my right arm. His right arm moved from its position pointed directly toward me and began moving to his right so that both arms mirrored mine. I expected to feel the pressure release from me when he stopped pointing directly at me, but I was unable to move. I watched as his billowy robe stretched and began framing his body into a rectangular form. His sunken eyes locked onto mine, and his brow furrowed before he began to look upward. As he began lifting his head, his neck gradually stretched further back in a way I didn't even think was possible for most flexible gymnasts. I anticipated the sound of his neck cracking, but what echoed in the white room was the sound of metal on glass, something like the echoes of screws and bolts being dropped onto a glass tabletop. His bizarre contortionist act continued while he kept his arms up to hold the same rectangular shape, and as his neck continued rounding backward, it completely disappeared behind his chest. The sight of the man with his neck fully bent backward terrified me, but the pressure holding me against the wall prevented me from looking in another direction. Not wanting to be caught off guard by the man, I continued staring ahead. With his neck no longer in view, the edges of the robe stiffened, and his form became increasingly defined until they were perfectly rectangular, and all I could see was the metallic cloth. The sound of the strange song began to fill the room, and I trembled, watching the four edges of his metallic robe blend into the wall directly behind him. The metallic gray material of his robe spread up through the ceiling and along the three remaining walls. I winced in fear as the song surrounded me with increasing volume and the gray robe enveloped the room. I felt something like a strong wind push me harder against the dent in the wall, now wrapped in the gray material. I sat thinking I was about to be consumed, only to wake up in another terrible realm, like the White Room, when suddenly the pressure released. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the man watching me, but the white wall covered in gray material was now the metallic ceiling of the elevator. I blinked hard in an attempt to refocus and confirmed I was now flat on my back on the elevator floor, no longer pushed up against the dented wall of the White Room. The door opened as the elevator chimed, and I looked outside the elevator to find myself on the first floor of the mall. I heard footsteps quickly approaching me, and I was met by a janitor that had left behind his cart of cleaning supplies as soon as he saw me lying on the ground inside the elevator. He quickly blocked the elevator door to prevent it from closing and bent down to help me up and ask if I was all right. Not fully understanding what had just happened, I just said I was fine and thanked him for helping me up. He told me that there was a loose piece of flooring in the elevator and that I was the second person this week who had tripped over it. He seemed genuinely upset and explained that this might keep happening because management wasn't prioritizing the repair. He walked with me to the mall entrance and said the mall had already been locked for about an hour before he found me. He said he didn't know how I was able to stick around unnoticed with most of the employees gone for the night, but that he was just glad I didn't get locked inside for the night. I thanked him, went outside, and watched as he locked the door to continue his work. As I stepped out of the mall into the buzzing fluorescent light of the parking lot, I felt the sensation of my body remembering the feeling of falling, somewhat like the phantom sensation you might feel after being on a swing for a while. As I got into my car and started it up, I turned on my headlights, which were pointed directly at the mall entrance. I began to slowly back up in the vacant parking lot, and as I began to turn, I looked at the glass entrance doors one last time. A second janitor had stopped by the front door and shook the handle to make sure it was locked. He looked up and out toward the parking lot, and I felt myself turn pale when I saw he had the angular face of the man in the White Room. My heart began to beat faster than I thought it was capable of beating, and I stepped on the gas pedal to quickly finish backing out. I shifted to drive and slammed on the gas pedal to get out of the parking lot as soon as I could, and in seconds I was at the end of the aisle. Because I was afraid I might have been followed, I checked my rearview mirror before turning out of the parking lot. Rather than finding the man close behind, he continued standing inside the mall, nearly pressed against the entrance doors. He backed up a bit and seemed to start stretching like anyone else might after a day of cleaning. But as his arms came down from above his head, they slowly settled in the same scarecrow-like position that he had held in the White Room. I couldn't see his eyes from my distance, but the position he was standing in proved that he was watching me. The screeching of my tires echoed as I peeled out of the parking lot, and I continued driving home. A minute or so later, I realized I'd been driving in silence, so I turned on the radio to calm my nerves. The last thing I had listened to was the local college radio station, and when I turned the radio back on, they were playing some sort of art pop song with a string section and what sounded like a small choir. Not wanting to hear any more experimental music, I quickly changed the radio to a local pop station, but in less than a minute I was so overstimulated that I turned the music off again and drove home in silence, listening only to the sound of passing cars and the mechanical hum of my own car's tires on concrete. That was the last time I went shopping after dark, and it's the reason I won't do it again, at least not anytime soon or in this town. If it hadn't been for the second janitor stopping to check the door after I left, I might have thought the whole experience was created in my head after tripping in the elevator and falling unconscious before the first janitor found me. I know this might end up taking a toll on my social life, but since that day I haven't been able to leave the house after dark, and sometimes I'm tempted to lock myself inside my home, regardless of the time of day. I still occasionally feel the sensation of falling in my stomach, even when I'm sitting still. And the sight of smoke from a burned-out candle in the right lighting begins to seem solid and metallic. After all that's happened, the cost to my social life is a small price to pay, because there's nothing I wouldn't do to ensure that I never again hear the haunting sound of a mechanical choir and the crashing sound of metal on glass.